Beneath the relentless sun of the Giza Plateau, beyond the selfie sticks and sandstone tours, something else may lie. Silent, massive, and hidden in plain sight. In early 2025, an international research team announced something extraordinary. The possible discovery of a vast underground system beneath Egypt's most iconic monuments. Not a tomb, not a cave, a structured geometric complex that defies every assumption we've ever made about ancient Egypt. The scans revealed corridors that twist, chambers that breathe with impossible symmetry, and vertical shafts dropping farther than any known construction of the ancient world. Using synthetic aperture radar, technology typically reserved for planetary exploration, the team uncovered what may be the first clear evidence of an intelligent substructure buried deep beneath the pyramids. And the reaction? Immediate and explosive. Some called it myth-making, others whispered it might be real. Critics labeled the findings dangerous. But the scans remain clean lines, echoes bouncing from stone, data too precise to ignore. Could this be the long-whispered hall of records, a buried archive from a civilization lost to time, or just another mirage conjured by our thirst for forgotten knowledge? One thing is clear: beneath the monuments that define our history, something waits. Whether truth or illusion, it challenges everything we thought we knew about Giza. So turn down the lights, let the shadows settle, and join us. Because the deeper we look, the stranger it gets. If the data is even half accurate, then this isn't just an archaeological footnote. It's a seismic shift in what we think we know about the ancient world. And the stakes, they're far bigger than just lost tombs or hidden rooms, because if this network, this sprawling geometric infrastructure buried deep beneath the Giza Plateau, is real, then it means the builders of the pyramids were not just architects of the surface, but masters of the earth below. It means the Giza complex wasn't just constructed upward, reaching for the gods. It was mirrored downward into the depths, following a blueprint we've only just begun to glimpse. A blueprint that could contain ceremonial chambers, vaults of lost knowledge, or technologies we've never attributed to the ancient world. And if we ignore it, if we dismiss it like so many out-there claims before, then we risk sealing away a part of history that may hold answers to questions we've stopped even asking, answers about who we were, about what was known, about what was deliberately buried. Already, the backlash has begun. Critics call it fantasy. Officials have denied permits. No ground has been broken. But make no mistake, what lies beneath Giza will not wait forever. The longer we hesitate, the deeper the truth recedes into myth. This isn't just a story about pyramids and sand. This is a story about what happens when we stand at the edge of the known and choose not to look. And if we turn away now, the past may stay silent forever. In modern archaeology, revolutions don't always begin with a shovel. Sometimes they start with a signal, a pulse of energy fired into the earth, returning in echoes. In the case of the Giza Plateau, that signal was synthetic aperture radar, or SIR. And what it brought back wasn't noise or static. It was a whisper, a pattern, a message in stone. SAR isn't your average radar. Originally developed for military and planetary imaging, this high-resolution remote sensing technology doesn't just skim the surface. It peers beneath it. Mounted on satellites or airborne drones, SAR emits precise electromagnetic pulses that travel deep underground, reflecting off changes in material density and structural voids. It can detect what lies hidden beneath layers of soil, sand, and time itself. And in early 2025, SAR was turned on one of the most iconic locations in human history, the Giza Plateau. What it found would change everything. At first, the readings seemed typical. Small voids, minor anomalies, exactly what you'd expect near an ancient site riddled with tombs and collapsed structures. But as the scans intensified, so did the anomalies. They began forming lines, then angles, then shapes, clean, deliberate, geometric. This wasn't geological noise, this was architecture. And then came the shafts. According to the radar data, there weren't just a few vertical cavities. There were 8 enormous cylindrical shafts, each descending straight down into the bedrock, far deeper than any known chamber on the plateau. Nearly 1,200 feet deep, a staggering depth, nearly twice the height of the Eiffel Tower. And it wasn't just the depth that shocked the researchers, it was the uniformity. The shafts appeared to be perfectly round, with smooth, polished walls. Too smooth, too consistent. Natural formations, especially at that scale, don't behave this way. Collapsed wells or seismic fault lines show irregularity, fractures, angles, chaos. But these shafts were consistent, engineered, deliberate. The deeper the scans went, the stranger the story became. Around several of the shafts, spiraling shapes began to emerge. At first, researchers thought they were radar artifacts, errors in the scan. But as more data poured in, the spirals solidified. These weren't glitches, these were structures, staircases, elegant, curling structures descending alongside the shafts like ancient corkscrews. Winding pathways that seemed too perfectly spaced, too evenly constructed to be anything but intentional. And they weren't narrow either. According to the radar depth returns, these spirals could accommodate multiple people at once, wide, massive, and engineered. It wasn't just that something had been built down there, it was that someone had built it to be used. With staircases, and came the implication of access, that people once moved through these vertical spaces, that a descent into the earth was not just symbolic, it was functional. This wasn't a sealed vault. It was an entry point. And then, just as researchers were digesting the enormity of what they were seeing, the base of 2 of these shafts revealed something even more astonishing. Cubic chambers, perfectly shaped, 80 meters wide. That's the size of a modern city block, excavated deep into the bedrock with mathematical precision. These weren't caves, these weren't tombs, these were rooms, designed, measured, executed with purpose. Each side of these cubes was nearly identical. Clean edges, straight walls, flat floors. The kind of architectural harmony you expect from a CAD render, not a structure supposedly carved over 4,000 years ago. The chambers weren't rough-hewn or misshapen. They were symmetrical, functional. It was like finding a cathedral where there was supposed to be dust, and the revelations didn't stop there. Around the outer perimeters of these giant cube-shaped rooms, the scans began revealing additional anomalies. Passageways, corridors, connection points. Some straight, others curved in deliberate arcs. What began to form wasn't just a collection of isolated rooms. It was a network, multiple levels, multiple entry points, overlapping architectural patterns. These weren't scattered ruins. This was a design, a blueprint buried beneath one of the most studied landscapes on Earth. The mapping data showed that many of these underground structures were aligned almost perfectly with features on the surface. Chambers beneath pyramids, corridors under temples, shafts that mirrored the geometry of the monuments above. The message became impossible to ignore. What lies beneath Giza was never an accident. It was never an afterthought. It was part of the plan. What that plan was, no one yet knows. But here's what we do know. SAR doesn't lie. It has no political agenda. It doesn't care what textbooks say. It only returns what is there. And what it returned was too consistent, too symmetrical, too deliberate to be coincidence. And yet, the backlash came fast. Egypt's antiquities. Authorities denied the existence of any such findings. No official dig permits, no excavation teams. Nothing, they said, was happening under the plateau. But the scans don't care. They just keep returning patterns. So what happens when hard science stumbles upon a secret buried in stone? Do we rush? To dig, or do we cover it back up and pretend we never saw it? Because if these shafts and staircases are real, if these cube-shaped cathedrals of stone are real, then the story of Giza isn't finished. It's only just beginning. As the team continued its scans, the map of the subterranean Giza plateau grew richer and stranger. It was no longer just isolated shafts and chambers. What emerged looked like an integrated, multi-layered complex, a kind of architectural nervous system, corridors intersecting like veins, chambers pulsing at key junctions. The deeper they looked, the more the ground beneath Giza behaved like a machine, or worse, like a memory. Some of the passages connected directly to what the radar interpreted as staging areas, rooms with multiple corridor access points, or chambers shaped like intersections, with curvature optimized for movement. It was, one researcher noted, less like a crypt and more like a terminal. Others went further. If this complex is real, they argued, it might not be a place of burial or worship at all. It might be something functional, something with intent beyond death or ceremony. This is where the questions began to shift. If this network had been discovered beneath some unmarked part of desert, far from the pyramids, it would have been a mystery. But the fact that it lives beneath the most symbolically loaded structure on the planet, beneath the pyramids themselves, suggests something far more deliberate. Because the alignments, they weren't vague, they were razor precise. Chambers aligned with the base of the Great Pyramid, corridors running directly below the Sphinx. One shaft, incredibly, fell perfectly beneath the intersection point of the three main pyramids, where their invisible central axes meet. That kind of alignment can't be luck. It's geometry, it's planning, and it's ancient. Some in the team quietly floated the unthinkable. What if the pyramids were built on top of this complex, not the other way around? That would mean the structures we see today are not the full story of Giza, but the upper level, the cap, the visible part of a much larger system. And if that's true, then history's most enduring monument may have been misunderstood for thousands of years. And yet, we've barely scratched the surface. Beneath the multi-level corridors and massive vaults, SAR scans suggested yet another layer, one even deeper. It didn't contain the same bold geometry, but it had structure, echoes of staircases, what looked like thin shafts or channels running deeper, steeper. These readings were fainter, harder to interpret. But some believed they could be ancient water systems, perhaps conduits or aqueducts. Others believed they might be escape routes, airways, or something ceremonial. None could say for certain. What they could agree on was this: these patterns were not nature. Nature is chaotic, it's jagged, fractured, asymmetrical. But this was language in stone, design thinking from a time before design was supposed to exist. Which brings us to the question at the heart of this entire investigation: who built this? It's easy to dismiss the complexity of the pyramids with enough manpower and time. But this, a coordinated subterranean system descending thousands of feet, built with precision and intent. There's no record of it, no inscriptions, no pharaoh's name, no blueprint passed down through the dynasties. It simply isn't in the official narrative. That silence speaks volumes, because the ancient Egyptians documented everything: rituals, burials, even grain counts. But not this. Not a project that would have taken years, lifetimes. Not a system that rivals the engineering of the pyramids above. Some have speculated this means the system predates dynastic Egypt, that it was built by an earlier culture. One we haven't identified. Or worse, one we have and simply haven't recognized yet. And this is where the theories begin to branch. Some believe it's the Hall of Records, built to survive cataclysm and time. Others think it's a ceremonial underworld meant to mirror the mythological duat, Still others think it was built by priest engineers whose names and knowledge were buried with them, erased by time or design. The radar doesn't answer those questions, but it forces us to ask them, because SAR, for all its power, can only reveal form. It cannot tell us who. It cannot tell us why. For that, we need access. But that's the one thing no one's allowed to have. Egyptian authorities have denied excavation permits. Critics claim the data is flawed, and mainstream archaeology continues to hold the line. No dig, no truth. But the scans remain, and they whisper. They whisper of something vast, hidden, structured, and possibly older than we dare admit. This is no longer about whether the underground complex exists. It's about whether we'll ever be allowed to see it. At first glance, it's easy to think we've seen everything there is to see about the pyramids. They've been photographed from every angle, mapped with lasers, and studied for centuries. We know their measurements down to the millimeter. But when you start looking beneath the surface, literally, you realize that what we've uncovered might only be a fraction of what was truly built, and what lies below. That's where things take a dramatic turn. Among the first truly startling discoveries from the radar scans were the vertical shafts, enormous, deep, and unnaturally smooth. But as the data was processed further, the radar began revealing something even more curious: patterns spiraling down the inner edges of the shafts. At first, researchers were cautious. Could this be artifacting? Noise from the signal? But the shapes kept appearing. They were consistent, evenly spaced, and eerily elegant. What they were seeing wasn't just random curvature, it was structural. Spirals descending neatly, hugging the inside of these shafts like threads on a massive screw. It didn't take long before the most plausible interpretation emerged: staircases. These weren't minor features. They were wide enough for multiple people to descend side by side, massive enough to suggest prolonged, repeated use, and precise enough to completely destroy any notion that this was a natural formation. No fault line spirals downward in uniform arcs. No collapsed tunnel leaves. Behind 80-degree curvature and rhythmic symmetry, these were engineered, and that's when the questions got darker. Because staircases, as mundane as they seem, imply something chillingly simple: access. They are made to be walked, used, ascended and descended over and over again, which means that someone not only built these shafts, but intended for others to enter them regularly, not just once. Not just as a burial site to be sealed, but as a path, a route into something deeper. So what were they walking into? At the bottom of two of these shafts, the radar reflected back the most jaw-dropping signatures yet. Vast, cube-shaped chambers, each measuring nearly 80 meters wide on every side. That's nearly the size of a Manhattan city block, carved directly into the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. They weren't jagged caves or sloping caverns. They were architectural, mathematical, cut at clean angles, geometrically pure. If it sounds impossible, that's because it should be. We're talking about structures of such size and regularity that, if they existed on the surface, would be hailed as the greatest finds in modern archaeology. But because they lie beneath one of the most heavily controlled sites on Earth, the world has barely heard about them. And even when it has, the conversation has been drowned in skepticism. But the geometry doesn't lie. Each chamber was nearly perfectly cubic, equal height, width, and length, corners that aligned, walls that echoed radar pulses with almost no degradation, suggesting polished or smoothed stone. This wasn't natural formation. This was design. And more than that, it was deliberate absence. These chambers weren't filled with stone. They were empty, silent voids carved with purpose. And in ancient architecture, silence often means intention. So what are we looking at? Some theorists believe these chambers could have been ceremonial spaces, vast rooms of initiation. Others point to their dimensions and alignment and ask, were these ancient archives, vaults. Were they meant to contain something once? And now, nothing remains? The radar can't tell us that. It can only show us form. But what that form implies is chilling. Because at this depth, with this scale, it would have taken years, decades, maybe centuries to carve a single chamber. The manpower, the resources, the logistics. It suggests not only planning, but endurance. An entire system beneath the earth that had to be maintained, not just made, and that's when you realize this wasn't an accident, it wasn't a detour from the pyramids above. This was part of the design, a mirror beneath the ground, reflecting the geometry above. Or possibly predating it. What's even more haunting is what sits around these cube chambers. The scans detected interlinking corridors, some straight, some gently curving toward intersection points. A few of them looped back toward the shafts. Others branched out and vanished into unreadable data. But what emerged wasn't chaos. It was a layout, a flow, a pattern of movement. Some corridors even appeared to shift direction gradually, as though guiding a person along a processional route. One interpretation, a ritual path, a guided descent, a trial, a journey. And when you place that in the context of Egyptian mythology, things get unsettling quickly, because the ancient Egyptians believed in an underworld called the Duat, a realm beneath the earth filled with gates, guardians, and sacred knowledge. It wasn't just a place for the dead, it was a place for the initiated, for transformation, for rebirth. The deeper you went, the closer you came to judgment, and possibly enlightenment. If this system beneath Giza was intended to echo that myth, then we may be looking not at a tomb, but at a simulation, a constructed underworld, a kind of architectural mythology built into stone, one that required its initiates to descend, step by step, spiral by spiral, into silence. And these chambers, they could have been the final destination, the inner sanctum. A place where ritual met geometry, and the past was buried not to be forgotten, but to be protected. But what if it wasn't spiritual at all? Another possibility looms, a darker one, that these cube chambers weren't symbolic, that they were functional. Massive underground rooms created to store something, preserve something, or contain something. Resources, technology, even knowledge. The symmetry, the size, the depth. None of it aligns with mere ceremony. These were not decorative. They were built to last, and yet no one speaks of them. No plaques, no records, not even inscriptions. They are silent, not just in design, but in history, like they were meant to be forgotten. That's what makes this discovery so haunting. It's not just the scale, it's the erasure. The fact that something so large, so deliberate and so complex has no name, and maybe that's the point, because sometimes things are buried not because they're forgotten, but because they're forbidden. Sometimes the most powerful evidence doesn't roar, it trickles. Beneath the massive shafts, and beneath even the cube-shaped chambers, the scans revealed something subtle. Not grand like the spiraling staircases, not architectural in the traditional sense, but persistent, almost quiet. Thin channels etched across the substructure like veins beneath skin. They weren't random. They followed routes, sloped paths, angled turns. Some even appeared to rise and fall with the natural elevation of the bedrock. These weren't faults. They weren't fissures. They were conduits, and they looked like they were built for water. At first, the discovery seemed out of place. Why would an underground stone complex, if that's what it is, include what appear to be water systems? But the more the researchers examined the scans, the clearer it became. Many of these channels weren't just present, they were integrated. They connected core points. They ran alongside the spiral stairs. Some terminated near the cube chambers. Others appeared to cut directly through the structure, weaving the layout together like capillaries in a circulatory system. The Giza Plateau may be in the desert today, but it wasn't always. Thousands of years ago, the Nile's floodplain reached Much closer, and ancient Egypt knew water not just as a resource, but as a reality-shaping force. In this context, water isn't just functional, it's foundational. The Nile wasn't a river, it was the axis of the civilization. Life, trade, farming, politics, and faith all centered around its rise and fall. The Egyptians worshipped its rhythms. Its floods weren't disasters, they were rebirth. The movement of water was a language, a sacred cycle. So to find potential water systems below Giza isn't just practical, it's mythologically charged. In Egyptian cosmology, the beginning of creation is the primordial water. None. From this infinite, dark, formless ocean, the first land emerged. The Benben. Upon that mound, the gods created the world. Water then wasn't just a symbol of life, it was a symbol of origin. A descent into water was a return to the source, a return to the before. So if these channels beneath the pyramids once carried water, whether through natural means or engineering, then we may be looking at more than just infrastructure. We may be looking at an underworld journey carved in stone. Some of the channels trace directly to the base of the cube-shaped chambers, as if feeding them. Others appear to encircle spiral descents, almost like moats or ceremonial rivers. Could these have once been filled? Could descending through the staircases have meant walking alongside or even through flowing water? The implications are startling, because in ancient Egyptian funerary tradition, the soul must journey through the duat, a watery, mysterious underworld filled with trials, guardians, and passageways. It was not a realm of fire or punishment, but one of shadows and echoes. The duat was described as containing rivers, lakes, pools of memory, and even barks, boats to carry the deceased or the initiated across cosmic boundaries. If this complex beneath Giza mirrors those descriptions, and the water channels aren't just geological chance, then we're not looking at some forgotten plumbing system. We're looking at a spiritual architecture, one that fused material engineering with cosmic symbolism, and that's where the duality emerges. Because as much as this water system may have had ceremonial meaning, there's also evidence it could have served practical functions, stabilizing underground temperature, providing humidity control, facilitating ventilation, even creating acoustic effects, echoes, resonance chambers, the sound of water moving through stone. This blend of use and meaning is classic Egypt. Nothing was ever just practical, and nothing was ever just spiritual. Their temples were calendars, their tombs were machines, their gods lived in geometry and measurement. So when water channels appear beneath Giza, they're not decoration, they're intention. Some of the scans even showed signs of erosion along the walls of the channels, gentle wear, as though water had moved through them not once, but for centuries. In some areas, the paths had been adapted, refined, or curved away from natural slopes. It wasn't just that water flowed there, it was that someone made sure it did. The radar also revealed wider spaces, choke points, where multiple channels converged. Were these cisterns holding tanks, or something more symbolic, points of purification? In Egyptian rituals, before entering a temple or sacred space, water was used to cleanse, to prepare. So if these cube chambers were ritual in nature and water was routed toward them, the implication is clear. Before entering the sacred, you must pass through the source. And then there's the acoustic dimension. In other ancient underground sites, like Malta's Hypogeum, researchers have discovered chambers with acoustics so precise they amplify certain frequencies while muting others. And when water flows through or around these structures, it creates low-frequency hums, resonance, vibrations that can alter the perception of space itself. Could Giza's understructure have done the same? Was the sound of flowing water part of the experience? Was it meant to evoke something beyond architecture, an emotional or psychological transformation? As the radar imaging painted more detail across the hidden structures, another theory began to emerge, one that bridged not just science and ritual, but utility and myth. What if water didn't just flow through these systems, but powered them? It sounds speculative, until you remember that ancient Egypt already mastered complex irrigation, water lifts, sluice gates, and pressure systems. They understood how to harness water not just for farming but for engineering. Some researchers even suggest that underground water pressure could have been used to assist construction, lifting, balancing, or easing the movement of enormous stones through buoyancy and controlled flooding. If these water systems once connected to ancient reservoirs or even to the Nile itself, then it's possible that Giza's underground complex was once alive with movement, of people, of material, of water. There's an almost haunting practicality to that idea, that beneath one of the most symbolically loaded sites on Earth, an invisible infrastructure pulsed like an artery, powering everything from ceremonies to construction. And if that doesn't feel monumental enough, consider what else water represents. In ancient Egyptian belief, water was also the gateway, the boundary between realms. The journey through the Duat wasn't made by walking alone. It often required sailing. Pharaohs were entombed with solar barks to carry them across the underworld. Gods like Ra were believed to travel across the sky by day and through the dark waters of the Duat by night. In this worldview, moving through water wasn't just transition, it was transformation. And if the channels beneath Giza mimicked that journey, if they were structured like rivers, if their shapes mirrored the sacred maps of the Duat, then we may be looking at one of the most literal translations of Egyptian cosmology ever constructed in stone. That idea, that myth, was embodied in physical architecture, is not new. But its scale here is staggering. Now take that symbolism and combine it with function. Water, as a cooling element, could have helped regulate the temperature of the underground complex. Subterranean temperatures are naturally more stable, but with airflow restricted, water could provide a form of passive climate control. Even without electrical technology, flowing water creates differential pressure, enough to generate subtle air movement, enough to keep long corridors breathable. Was it possible that this system sustained human presence underground? That people moved, worked, maybe even lived for periods beneath the surface? The presence of erosion patterns, some ancient and smooth, others sharp and directional, suggests more than just symbolic layout. It suggests long-term use, repetition, channeling, engineering not just for one-time ritual but for ongoing operation. This wasn't ceremonial flooding, it was intentional infrastructure, and yet no writings speak of it, no carvings describe it. If it existed, it was hidden not only underground, but outside of recorded memory. Which leads us to one final possibility, one that haunts the edge of both archaeology and alternative history. That this water system was not just built by the Egyptians we know, but by a culture before them, a culture that understood water not only as a material force, but as a symbolic and spatial one. A culture whose identity may be lost, but whose influence lingers beneath the surface of Egyptian tradition. Some speculate about pre-dynastic engineers. Others whisper of Atlantis. Whatever the origin, the water veins beneath Giza suggest a mindset far beyond brute labor. They suggest systems thinking, purpose, legacy, and perhaps most haunting of all, these channels may still carry traces of their use. Sediment analysis, isotopic residue, mineral buildup, all of these are testable with today's technology. If any of the underground conduits still retain ancient mineral signatures or water-carved geometry, we may be able to date the flow, even if we can't date the stone. Water, after all, leaves memory, in layers of sediment, in trails of erosion, in the way it reshapes the world long after it's gone. And that memory could help us uncover what the monuments above have refused to tell us for generations. For now, no tests have been authorized, no core samples, no physical probes. The entire system remains locked beneath regulations and sand. But when we eventually get access, if we do, it may be the water, not the stone, that tells the oldest story. A story not about conquest or kingship, but about flow, about passage, about the journey from surface to source, from symbol to substance, from world to underworld, and perhaps back again. For generations, whispers have circled the Giza Plateau, not just of pyramids or tombs, but of something buried deeper, something hidden by time and protected by intention. A library, a vault, a chamber that doesn't just preserve bodies or artifacts, but knowledge. It's called the Hall of Records. To many, it's just a myth, a fixture of alternative history and new age storytelling, but for others, it's a persistent echo, an idea that won't go away. And now, in light of recent radar scans and structural anomalies beneath Giza, that echo is louder than ever. The concept of the Hall of Records isn't new. It spans multiple traditions, from Hermetic texts to esoteric mysticism. But it was popularized in the 20th century by one enigmatic figure, Edgar Cayce, an American mystic who, in trance-like states, spoke of an ancient archive buried near the pyramids, one that housed the secrets of Atlantis, of early human civilization, and even the cosmic design of the soul. According to Cayce, this vault would be discovered when humanity was ready, when the world stood on the cusp of remembering what it had once forgotten. Skeptics scoffed. There was no evidence, no map, no texts from Egypt itself pointing to such a chamber, and for nearly 100 years the idea sat quietly at the edge of credibility, filed under interesting but unfounded. But now, something's changed, because when synthetic aperture radar began scanning beneath Giza, it didn't return just empty space. It returned structure. It revealed chambers, corridors, right angles, cubic geometry buried hundreds of meters beneath the plateau. Not crude voids or collapsed caverns, but engineered space, patterned, aligned, deliberate. And what's most striking isn't just what the scans found, it's where they found it. One of the largest subsurface structures detected sits precisely where Cayce's readings once claimed the Hall of Records would be, southeast of the Great Pyramid, near the right paw of the Sphinx. Coincidence? Maybe. But that overlap between myth and map has reignited the possibility that the Hall of Records might not be just a story. It might be real. And if it is, it opens a door far wider than most are prepared to walk through. Because the hall, as described, isn't just a building. It's a time capsule, a master archive of lost history. Some traditions say it contains scrolls or tablets written in ancient scripts, long since forgotten. Others claim it holds blueprints of pre-dynastic civilization, records of Atlantis, or even cosmic codes etched into crystal or stone. It's tempting to get carried away, to imagine gilded vaults filled with technology or prophecy. But the more grounded version is just as provocative, that this chamber, if it exists, could contain written material from a time before known Egyptian dynasties. Inscriptions, tablets, perhaps not otherworldly, but older than anything we've yet seen. Because here's the strange truth. The deeper we go into Egypt's history, the more refined the architecture becomes. The earliest pyramids, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, are far more precise, symmetrical, and technically advanced than those built just centuries later. That's backward from how progress usually works, which raises a question. What if the most advanced builders weren't the beginning of a dynasty, but the end of a forgotten one? And what if the Hall of Records was their message to the future, a final effort to preserve their knowledge before disappearing beneath the sands? It's this possibility, not of aliens or magic, but of forgotten human genius that has drawn serious independent researchers to the idea. Because the hall, whether real or metaphor, represents something more powerful than relics. It represents a narrative we've lost, a part of our story we haven't written down, not because it never happened, but because we've forgotten it. And now, the ground may be remembering for us. For those drawn to the idea of the hall, the timing of these radar revelations feels almost poetic. Casey's predictions spoke of a discovery in the late 20th or early 21st century. And while his visions were mystical and vague, the new data, hard, measurable, empirical, is anything but. It tells a story not in prophecy, but in geometry. Because what makes these underground structures so captivating isn't just their size or alignment, it's the repetition. Multiple chambers, each roughly cubic, corridors with mirrored curvature, shafts that drop at nearly identical angles. These are not the chaotic remnants of a collapsed structure. They're the fingerprint of design, and that's what gives the Hall of Records theory new traction. Because if the Giza Plateau was built with a dual layer, sacred monuments above and sacred vaults below, then perhaps the purpose wasn't just burial or ceremony. Perhaps it was transmission, a preservation of knowledge across cataclysm and time. Alternative history researchers have long speculated that such a vault would have been buried intentionally, not hidden by nature, but protected by design. Its entrance concealed, its contents sealed, its very existence denied, until tools like SR made it impossible to ignore. And therein lies the irony. It may be modern technology that finally uncovers the oldest knowledge humanity has ever known. Still, not everyone is convinced. Mainstream Egyptologists point out rightly that there is no ancient Egyptian inscription or artifact that clearly names a hall of records. The Sphinx, while symbolically important, is not associated in official records with any subterranean library. They argue that Casey's predictions were filtered through mysticism, and that drawing a straight line from his visions to the radar scans is speculative at best. But even skeptics admit something is there. The question is no longer if underground. Structures exist beneath the Giza Plateau. It's what they are and why they were built in the first place. And perhaps even more importantly, why were they forgotten? Because this isn't a minor oversight. If the underground complex is real, and the data strongly suggests it is, then we are talking about the single most significant omission in ancient Egyptian history. A massive, engineered substructure, geometrically aligned with the most iconic monuments on Earth, and yet not a single line of hieroglyphic text mentions it. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens by intention. One theory suggests the underground system predates dynastic Egypt, built by a pre-civilization, whose memory was intentionally erased or slowly lost through time. Another proposes that only a select few within the priesthood knew of its existence, using it as a restricted ceremonial or initiatory site, protected from outside interference. Both ideas point toward the same haunting possibility, that the deeper truth of Giza has been protected not just by sand and stone, but by silence. And maybe the Hall of Records isn't just a myth to be proved or disproved. Maybe it's a metaphor for something larger, the unremembered past. A symbol of what lies just beyond our reach, not because it's impossible to find, but because we've stopped looking. Now, with every new scan, every echo returned from beneath the bedrock, we are invited to remember, to look again, to see through the stone and into the spaces that history has tried to forget. What we'll find there, if we ever reach it, may not be scrolls or crystal tablets or lost blueprints from Atlantis. It may be something even more powerful. Context, a reminder that our past is far older, far stranger, and far more intelligent than we've been led to believe. And if the Hall of Records does exist, if a vault of forgotten knowledge truly waits beneath the Giza Plateau, then its discovery won't just rewrite textbooks, it will rewrite the story of us. No great mystery goes unchallenged, especially when it threatens the bedrock of what we think we know. So it was only a matter of time before the radar-based claims beneath the Giza Plateau sparked something far bigger than curiosity. They sparked a firestorm. On one side, the research team using synthetic aperture radar, SAR, to scan deep beneath the Earth, revealing what they described as shafts, chambers, staircases, and systems too precise to be natural. On the other, a wave of backlash from the mainstream archaeological community, led by none other than Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most recognized and most controversial Egyptologist. Hawass didn't mince words. In interviews and public statements, he dismissed the findings as nonsense, unscientific, and dangerous. He claimed there were no official permits granted for the scans, no legitimate excavations authorized under the Giza Plateau, and most critically, no real data that had passed through proper academic scrutiny. To him, the entire radar revelation was not just speculative, it was fake news, and from the traditional academic perspective, the criticisms hit familiar points. The findings weren't peer-reviewed. The radar images made public were AI-generated mock-ups, not raw geological slices. And most damning of all, the technology used, while powerful, wasn't designed for this depth or precision. You can't detect chambers 2 kilometers deep. Using radar alone, said one prominent critic, the signal degrades, the noise becomes indistinguishable from form. But here's where the debate becomes less about data and more about dogma, because while it's true that peer review is the gold standard of scientific validation, it's also true that some of history's most important discoveries began outside the mainstream. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Rosetta Stone, even the initial excavations at Göbekli Tepe faced dismissal until further study proved otherwise. So the question becomes, is the criticism about methodology or about control? Academic institutions are built on consensus, and consensus is slow to change, especially when that change threatens the foundational narrative of an entire civilization. If these underground structures beneath Giza are real, if they truly exist, then everything we've been taught about the timeline, purpose, and complexity of ancient Egypt would need to be revised. And for some, that's not just uncomfortable, it's unacceptable. Take, for example, the question of who gets to explore Giza. Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities has tight control over access to the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the surrounding plateau. Excavation permits are rare, and foreign-led research projects are closely monitored. In that context, a team using remote scanning tech without official sanction becomes not just suspicious, but a political problem. And so, the narrative war begins. Supporters of the radar findings point to the geometry, the clean lines, the symmetrical chambers, the repeatable angles. This isn't random, they say. These are engineered spaces, and engineered spaces demand explanation. Skeptics counter with technical limitations. Ground-penetrating radar has depth constraints. SAR is better suited for surface mapping or shallow imaging. At best, they say, what's being detected are density anomalies, natural shifts in bedrock, underground aquifers, or collapsed voids interpreted as design. But here's the thing, both sides are right and wrong. Because yes, radar interpretation is tricky. Echoes can be misread, stone can mimic structure, but it's also true that consistent geometry, especially geometry that aligns with surface features, is rare in nature, and even rarer when mirrored across multiple scans. Then there's the issue of access. Critics demand excavation. If these chambers are real, they say, why not dig? But the same authorities who demand proof also deny permission to investigate further. It's a catch-22. No peer review without excavation, no excavation without permits, no permits because the data isn't peer-reviewed. Meanwhile, the public watches from the sidelines, caught between the thrill of discovery and the weight of skepticism. Some are pulled toward the idea that maybe, just maybe, there's more to Giza than we've been allowed to see. Others fall back on Occam's razor. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's where this firestorm gets personal, because it's not just a clash of science versus speculation, it's a clash of worldviews. On one side of the debate sits the establishment, peer-reviewed journals, government-sponsored archaeologists, state-controlled excavation permits, and legacy institutions whose reputations are tied to a timeline that has remained mostly unchanged for decades. On the other side are independent researchers, technologists, fringe academics, and the curious public, many of whom are no longer satisfied with the neatness of official history. This isn't just about Giza anymore, it's about epistemology. Who gets to decide what counts as truth? And that brings us to the deeper layer of this firestorm, control of the narrative. For decades, Egyptology has operated under a relatively tight, interpretive framework. The dynasties, the deities, the rituals, all mapped, catalogued, and explained. But discoveries like the ones suggested by the radar scans threaten to unravel that comfort, not by introducing fantasy, but by introducing the unknown. If the subterranean chambers are real, and if their purpose is outside our current understanding, it implies there were motives, technologies, and knowledge systems in play that we have not accounted for. That alone shakes the foundations of the consensus model, which is why voices like Dr. Hawass are not just defending archaeological integrity, they're defending a worldview, one in which the mysteries of Egypt have already been solved. One in which the Great Pyramid is merely a tomb, the Sphinx is a sculpture from Khafra's reign, and the sand holds no more secrets, just stone and time and story. But here's the thing, the data keeps coming. Independent radar teams, geophysicists, and private labs continue to probe the plateau, quietly, remotely, and sometimes without sanction. And while not all findings are conclusive, a pattern is beginning to form, not just geometrically underground, but socially, above ground. The public is beginning to shift. Curiosity is outpacing orthodoxy. That shift is fueled in part by modern tools. Satellite imaging, remote sensing, LiDAR, and SAR all allow researchers to explore without digging. And for the first time in history, that exploration is decentralized. You don't need to be a tenured professor or a government-approved expedition leader. All you need is data and time and the willingness to look. That democratization of discovery is what makes this firestorm so powerful and so dangerous to institutions. Because the more people can verify, visualize, and analyze from afar, the less control centralized authorities have over the interpretation. And that's a frightening proposition for any discipline that has, for centuries, spoken from the top down. Of course, this doesn't mean that every radar echo is a lost vault of wisdom. Skepticism is still essential. Peer review is essential. Not all data is good data. Not every anomaly is a revelation. But at the same time, not every absence of evidence is evidence of absence. We've seen this pattern before. Göbekli Tepe, once dismissed as a hill, turned out to be one of the oldest temple complexes ever found, upending our understanding. Of Neolithic culture, the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden for millennia, dismissed by some until they became the cornerstone of biblical scholarship. Even Troy, long thought to be myth, was revealed to be real. So the question isn't whether the backlash is justified, it's whether it's open-minded. Are critics willing to test the findings independently? Or are they too quick to denounce out of fear that they might be wrong? And are the researchers making bold claims Or are they raising bold questions because that's the nuance lost in the middle of this firestorm? Most of the radar team isn't claiming they found Atlantis or alien vaults. They're saying, we found anomalies, we found symmetry, we found voids where none should exist. Let's look deeper. That's not conspiracy, that's science. Or at least it's what science should be. But in this case, science is stalled by bureaucracy. Excavation is blocked by red tape. And truth, whatever it may be, is caught in the crossfire. So where does that leave us? It leaves us here, standing at the edge of one of the world's most iconic archaeological sites, peering into the data, listening to the critics, and asking the most uncomfortable question of all. What if they're right? What if the underground complex is real? What if it was meant to be hidden? And what if we're still choosing not to see it, not because it isn't there, but because we're not ready? In the end, the Giza Plateau is still sand and stone and shadow, but above it the battle for its truth burns hotter than ever. And like all great fires, this one won't stop until it consumes the story it set out to challenge. For all the concrete facts we've collected about the Great Pyramid, its dimensions, orientation, construction methods, some of its most important features remain completely unexplained. And strangely, these aren't obscure details or minor decorations. They're central components, right there in the blueprint, seen by every visitor, and still, to this day, not fully understood. Take, for instance, the subterranean chamber. It's the lowest of the three main interior spaces inside the Great Pyramid, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the base. Unlike the King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber, which are geometrically refined, polished, and symmetrical, the subterranean chamber is raw, crude, irregular, like it was left unfinished or intentionally left primitive. Why? That's the question that has haunted archaeologists for decades. One theory says it was an early burial chamber, abandoned when construction plans shifted. Maybe the builders changed course and decided to move the tomb higher. Maybe they refined their ambitions mid-project. But if that's the case, why complete the shaft that descends all the way down to it? Why carve an entire chamber and leave it as it is, without decoration, without purpose, without closure? There's another theory, a darker one, that the subterranean chamber wasn't made for a body, but for ritual. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, what lies beneath the earth is not just dirt and stone, it's the duat, the underworld, a space between life and death, a domain of testing, judgment, and transformation. Could the rough, echoing walls of the subterranean chamber be more than functional? Could they be symbolic, meant to immerse the initiate in silence, in disorientation? Some theorists even suggest it was a chamber for the living, not the dead. A place of isolation, meditation, a space where someone would go to strip away the outside world and encounter something primal, perhaps divine. It's speculation, yes, but when you step inside that space, when you see it not as a flaw, but as a choice, the mystery deepens, and it's not the only one. Jump from beneath the pyramid to above it, and you find another riddle, the so-called Big Void. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project used a technique called muon tomography, essentially a way of tracking subatomic particles as they move through mass, to detect a massive sealed cavity directly above the Grand Gallery. It's roughly 30 meters long, about the size of a commercial jet, completely enclosed, completely inaccessible, and completely unknown until just a few years ago. It's not a crack, it's not a flaw, it's a space intentionally preserved inside one of the most precisely built structures in human history. What is it? Some engineers have suggested it's a weight-relieving chamber, a structural necessity to reduce stress on the gallery below. That's possible. But if it's just an architectural trick, why has it never been documented? Why no markings? No access shafts? Why hide it so completely? Others believe it may have symbolic importance, a spiritual chamber, a void not just in structure, but in meaning, designed to represent the unknown, the transition, the space between earthly and divine. Even more provocative is its location. The void sits directly above the Grand Gallery, a steep, ascending passageway believed to be one of the most ceremonially charged spaces in the entire monument. That alignment raises the possibility that whatever the void was meant to be, it was meant to hover above something powerful, but like so many things in the pyramid, no one can say for sure, and the riddles keep coming. There are 4 small, narrow shafts, 2 in the king's chamber, 2 in the queen's, each angled sharply upward. The shafts in the king's chamber exit the pyramid, but those in the queen's chamber, they stop short, sealed, no exit, no destination. Early explorers believed they were ventilation ducts, until they realized the ones in the queen's chamber don't even reach outside. So why carve them? Why angle them towards specific parts of the sky, Sirius, Orion's belt, if not for some kind of ritual alignment? Robotic probes sent into the Queen's shafts have discovered even more confusion. Doors, miniature stone blocks with copper handles. Behind them, more voids, more stone, more mystery, no clear purpose, no known reason, just intention and silence. These shaft doors sparked intense debate. Some Egyptologists argued they were symbolic, pointing to the stars, perhaps meant to guide the pharaoh's soul. Others suggested they were architectural quirks. Yet when robotic cameras were sent beyond one of the blocks, they revealed another sealed stone, like a nested puzzle box within the body of the pyramid itself. If the shafts were never meant to carry air and never meant to be accessed by the living, then what are they? Signal channels? Stargates in symbolic form? Or just doors to nowhere, intended to be seen, but never opened? The mystery remains sealed in stone. And then there's the most visible anomaly of all, one that everyone notices but few question deeply: the missing capstone. The Great Pyramid does not taper to a perfect point. Its top is flat, its peak missing. The structure that once sat at its summit, known as the Pyramidion, is long gone. No definitive trace of it has ever been found. In other pyramids, the capstone was small but deeply symbolic, often polished, gilded, or inscribed. It represented the Benben stone, the mythic first mound of creation, the place where divine energy touched the earth. To cap a pyramid was to complete the spiritual circuit, heaven to earth, sky to stone. So why is the most iconic pyramid of all unfinished? Some believe it was stolen or destroyed during antiquity, lost along with the smooth white casing stones that once made the pyramid shimmer in the sun. Others suggest it was never placed to begin with, that the absence is intentional. According to this view, the Great Pyramid is not incomplete. It's symbolically open, a structure of sublime perfection that deliberately stops short to represent the ungraspable, the unknown, the divine, the final ascent of the soul. It's an idea echoed in certain mystical traditions that the highest knowledge cannot be built, only pursued, that what is missing is not a flaw, but a mirror reflecting our own incompletion. And then, as if to anchor these riddles in material form, there's the inventory stela, a slab of granite stored quietly in a Cairo museum. Dismissed by some, treasured by others, it contains a short but controversial line that Pharaoh Khufu restored the Sphinx, not built it. This one sentence flips the mainstream timeline on its head, because the dominant theory in Egyptology is that Khufu's son, Khafre, constructed the Sphinx during his reign, around 2500 BCE. But if Khufu restored it, that means the Sphinx already existed, possibly long before the pyramids themselves. This matches what some independent researchers have been suggesting for decades, that the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, not wind or sand. That its body has been shaped by rainfall, something Egypt hasn't seen in sufficient quantity for thousands of years. If the Sphinx is that old, perhaps even pre-dynastic, then the entire Giza complex may be a palimpsest, a layered site, a place reused, repurposed, and reimagined over millennia, a place whose original builders may remain unnamed and unknown, which brings us full circle. Because while mainstream archaeology has offered us tools, carbon dating, stratigraphy, architectural chronology, it has not offered us certainty. Not in the case of the subterranean chamber, not in the big void, not in the sealed shafts, the missing capstone, or the Sphinx's debated age. What it has offered instead is a kind of curated uncertainty, a tolerance for mystery so long as it stays within the lines. But the pyramid doesn't stay within lines. It cuts through them, through time, through tradition, through what we know and what we think we know, and in doing so, it leaves us with the most human of invitations, to wonder, to ask, to look again. Because maybe the Great Pyramid was never built just to house a king. Maybe it was built to house a question, one that thousands of years later we are still trying to answer. You can see it from almost anywhere in Cairo, a silhouette older than history itself. The Great Pyramid of Giza, imposing, eternal, monumental, and yet if you look closely you'll notice something strange, something missing. The top is flat, that sharp, perfect point we imagine when we picture a pyramid. It's not there. Instead, the pyramid ends in a broad, unfinished plateau, a rough cut where symmetry should have met in convergence. The capstone, or pyramidion, is gone. This missing piece is one of the most visible features of the entire monument, and yet it's also one of its least explained. Why is the capstone absent? Was it ever there? And if it was, what happened to it? The traditional explanation is simple. It was removed. Over thousands of years, earthquakes, looting, and time have stripped the pyramid of its smooth white casing, stones, so it stands to reason that the small final stone at its summit was taken too, lost or shattered or stolen, just like the others. But not everyone is convinced, because the Great Pyramid isn't like the others, unlike later pyramids, which degrade, crumble, and shift. The Great Pyramid has endured. Its internal geometry, external orientation, and foundational stability are unmatched. It was built with uncanny precision, aligned to true north with a margin of error less than 1/20th of a degree. Its base is almost perfectly level. Its stones, interlocked without mortar, have resisted erosion for millennia. This level of precision doesn't end in accident. So if the rest of the pyramid was finished with such exacting standards, why would its most symbolically important component, the summit, be left to chance? That's where the mystery deepens. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the capstone wasn't just a finishing touch. It was the Benben stone, the mythic peak that rose from the primordial waters at the beginning of creation. It was the place where divine energy first touched the earth. The pyramidion in this worldview wasn't architectural. It was cosmic. Some capstones have been recovered from other pyramids. They're usually small, just a few feet tall, often polished, sometimes gilded, symbolic rather than structural. But the Great Pyramid's capstone has never been found. No remnant, no fragment, no definitive mention of its installation, and that absence raises a quiet, haunting possibility. Maybe it was never placed. Maybe the builders of the Great Pyramid didn't forget, or lose, or fail to install the capstone. Maybe they chose to leave it off. That idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. In certain esoteric traditions, the unfinished pyramid represents an incomplete journey, a structure that reflects the ascent of human consciousness, but stops short of divinity. The final step is not built in stone. It must be achieved internally. In this reading, the flat top is not a flaw. It's a statement. The pyramid rises with order, symmetry, and strength, but it doesn't pretend to complete the spiritual arc. It leaves room for transcendence, for what cannot be carved, for what must be lived. you'll find this symbolism echoed across time, even on the back of the US dollar bill, an unfinished pyramid with an all-seeing eye above it. The implication is the same. Something above remains unmanifested. Something that must be realized, not installed. So if the capstone of the Great Pyramid was never added, what does that tell us about its purpose? Was it meant as a monument to the known or a threshold to the unknowable? This theory, that the missing capstone was intentional, transforms the pyramid from a complete object into an invitation. A structure designed not to represent perfection, but to frame its pursuit. In this reading, the missing top is not what failed to be built, it's what cannot be built. Some have even proposed that the capstone's absence represents the unknowable nature of the divine, that the pyramid was constructed as a spiritual machine, a cosmic diagram, and that its missing peak was meant to reflect a sacred mystery, that enlightenment can be pointed to but never fully contained in form. This idea aligns not only with esoteric Egyptian thought, but also with later mystical traditions, the Kabbalistic tree of life with its hidden 11th sapphira, the Buddhist mandala with its open center, and the concept of negative space in Eastern philosophy, the idea that what isn't there defines the meaning of what is. But if we return from symbolism to physicality, there's still the architectural question. What would the capstone of the Great Pyramid have looked like? Some have speculated that it may have been made of a unique material, electrum, granite, basalt, even an unknown alloy. Others believe it may have contained inscriptions or star maps. Some fringe theories claim it held a crystalline structure or a metallic core, perhaps even functioning as a kind of antenna or energy channel. Again, there's no physical evidence. No fragments have been found. No stela describes its shape or composition, and yet the speculation persists because the question persists. Why would the most advanced structure of the ancient world be left incomplete? Even modern reconstructions struggle with the capstone. Artists, model builders, and digital archaeologists debate its shape, slope, height. Some reconstructions show a sharp point, others a flattened dome. No version has been proven because no version has been found, and that makes the absence more powerful than any presence. In the 20th century, during attempts to climb or restore parts of the pyramid, some engineers proposed installing a symbolic capstone, a modern addition, a gesture of completion, but the idea was abandoned. Even the Egyptian government knew, you don't place a crown on a mystery, you leave it open. This unfinished summit is visible to all who visit. It's one of the first things you notice, and yet, curiously, it's rarely addressed in guidebooks or tourist materials, as if it's an open wound in the narrative, or maybe something so obvious it hides in plain sight. And that's where the capstone becomes more than a feature of stone. It becomes a mirror, because for all the engineering, all the math, all the spiritual symbolism layered into the Great Pyramid, its top remains open, flat, incomplete, like a sentence waiting for a final word, a question mark made of limestone. It doesn't tell us what to think. It tells us that something is missing, and that maybe what's missing is us, our understanding, our will to ask, our readiness to see the pyramid not as a solved problem, but as a living text. This is why the capstone matters, not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't, not because it held some magical crystal, but because its absence points toward a truth older than science and bigger than myth, that some things were built not to end in answers, but to begin in questions. And the top of the Great Pyramid, the part everyone notices, but few truly ponder, is one of the most elegant questions ever carved into the earth. Tucked away in the Cairo Museum, behind protective glass and museum silence, sits a stone that few tourists pay attention to, and even fewer scholars talk about. It's not massive, it's not golden, It doesn't glow with mysticism or whisper esoteric riddles. But what it says may be more explosive than anything written inside the tombs of kings. It's called the Inventory Stela. Carved in the 26th dynasty, sometime around 600 BCE, the stela appears at first to be an ordinary donation record. It lists offerings made by Pharaoh Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, to the goddess Isis. It documents items given to her temple. It follows the usual structure of a formal record, until one line breaks the pattern and breaks the timeline. The stela claims that Khufu didn't build the Sphinx, he restored it. That single verb, restored, unravels everything. Because according to mainstream Egyptology, the Sphinx was commissioned by Khafre, Khufu's son, around 2500 BCE, carved during the 4th dynasty, built as part of his funerary complex, a face sculpted in his image. That's the accepted version. It's printed in textbooks, taught in universities, and displayed on placards at the site. But the Inventory Stela suggests otherwise. If Khufu restored the Sphinx, then it already existed before he built the Great Pyramid, which means the Sphinx predates the pyramid complex entirely, which means the Sphinx is older than we thought, possibly far older. Mainstream scholars dismiss the claim. They argue that the Inventory Stela is a much later artifact, created during the Sate period, long after the original events. They suggest it was written by priests seeking to glorify their temple, retroactively linking it to Egypt's most powerful pharaoh, a kind of propaganda piece meant to legitimize their sanctuaries through association. And that might be true, but it also might not be, because when you pair the Inventory Stela with another, more physical line of evidence, the picture gets murkier and much harder to ignore. That second line of evidence is erosion. The body of the Sphinx, carved directly from limestone bedrock, shows clear signs of heavy weathering. But it's not the type of erosion you'd expect from desert winds. It's vertical, rounded, flowing, as if caused by rain, and lots of it. Here's the problem. Egypt hasn't seen sustained rainfall of that kind in over 5,000 years. Geologists like Dr. Robert Schoch have argued that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it could date back to 7,000 BCE or earlier, long before dynastic Egypt began. His claims, while controversial, are supported by comparative studies of limestone weathering, and by the fact that the Sphinx enclosure, protected from wind, shows more erosion than the exposed parts of the plateau. This doesn't fit with the official narrative. If the Sphinx is truly that old, it means it predates not only the pyramids, but agriculture in much of the ancient world. It would force a complete re-evaluation of human development in Northeast Africa, and yet the Inventory Stela calmly supports that idea with a single line, recorded not by mystics, but by temple scribes. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply states, Khufu restored the Sphinx. Now you could argue it's an error, a poetic flourish, a historical mix-up, but the alignment between that inscription and the geological evidence raises a question bigger than any individual artifact. What if the timeline is wrong? What if dynastic Egypt was not the beginning of civilization, but the inheritance of it? What if the Sphinx wasn't built to guard the pyramids, but the other way around? And what if the Inventory Stela wasn't a forgery, but a forgotten truth, written too late to be believed? Of course, the mainstream response has been consistent: caution, criticism, and skepticism. Egypt's leading archaeologists argue that the dating of the Inventory Stela simply disqualifies it from historical authority. It was carved over 1,800 years after Khufu's reign, hardly a reliable source, they say, for events that happened in the Old Kingdom. And yet, ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with preservation. They kept temple records, mythic cycles, dynastic lines, agricultural calendars, all with astonishing accuracy. So why would this stela, with its formal phrasing and structured hierarchy, get one of its most important claims wrong? That's the tension. The stela sits in a grey zone, too late to be confirmed by dynastic evidence, but too specific to dismiss as fabrication. And that grey zone is exactly where Egypt's timeline begins to fray. Because if the Sphinx is older than the pyramids, then who carved it? What culture had the tools, the vision, the resources to shape a monument of that scale from solid limestone and leave behind no inscription, no record, no signature? This leads into the realm of pre-dynastic speculation, theories that an earlier civilization, native or otherwise, once existed in the Nile Valley, building monuments, mapping stars, engineering sacred geometry. These ideas have been ridiculed by academics, yet they persist because they explain the gaps. The gap in erosion patterns, the gap in construction skill, the gap in time. Even within dynastic records, there are references to a Zep Tepi, the first time, a mythical era when the gods walked the earth and established Ma'at, the cosmic order. To most scholars, Zep Tepi is symbolic, but to others, it hints at a memory, a trace of real history, blurred by myth. Could the Sphinx come from that memory? If so, the inventory stela becomes more than a misplaced document. It becomes a clue. 1. Overlooked artifact in a museum, quietly contradicting everything we thought we knew. And here's the thing, this wouldn't be the first time a major historical narrative was disrupted by a single object. The Rosetta Stone rewrote our understanding of hieroglyphics. The Dead Sea Scrolls shook the foundation of biblical scholarship. Sometimes history waits in plain sight until we're ready to read it differently. That's the power of the inventory stela, not because it proves a conspiracy, but because it asks a better question. What else have we missed? And if the timeline is this fragile, if it can bend under the weight of one forgotten inscription, then what does that say about the rest of our assumptions? It's easy to think of ancient Egypt as a closed case, dates, kings, temples, a timeline carved in stone. But the more we look, the more that stone begins to shift, to blur, to whisper of older builders, of reclaimed monuments, of dynasties built atop something already sacred. In this view, the Sphinx is not a statue of a pharaoh, it is a guardian of memory, one whose face may have been recarved, one whose body was eroded long before Khufu ever laid his foundation stones, one whose story begins not with inscription, but with erosion, and continues not in myth, but in data. The inventory stela may never be accepted by mainstream scholars as authoritative, but it exists. It was carved, it was discovered, it was translated, and its words remain. That in itself is enough, because sometimes the quietest artifact speaks the loudest, not in proof, but in possibility. Beneath the sand and stone of Giza, we've wandered through staircases and shafts, chambers and channels, myths and measurements. We've seen radar echoes hint at the unimaginable. We've followed water veins to symbolic underworlds. We've faced sealed doors, unfinished peaks, and inscriptions that defy the accepted timeline. And after all of it, after the technology, the legends, the skepticism, one truth remains unshaken. We still don't know. We don't know who first walked the spiral stairs beneath the plateau. We don't know what the cubic chambers were meant to hold. We don't know why the Sphinx shows signs of rain where no rain has fallen in thousands of years. We don't know what was meant to sit atop the Great Pyramid or why it never did. Don't even know if we're supposed to know, because for all our scanning, all our excavation, all our storytelling, Giza continues to hold its silence. Not out of malice, not out of secrecy, but out of scale, out of time. And maybe that's the real lesson. That history isn't a solved puzzle, it's a living terrain, a place we walk not to conquer, but to listen, to revisit, to wonder. Not every mystery needs to be answered, But every mystery, when met with curiosity, has the power to change us. Maybe the pyramids weren't built to show us what the ancients knew. Maybe they were built to show us what we still don't. So the next time you see that jagged peak of limestone against the Egyptian sky, the next time someone tells you it's all been figured out, the next time you hear a whisper from beneath the stone, pause and let that question echo, because somewhere beneath your feet, beneath the layers of narrative and sand and stone, something is waiting. Maybe not to be understood, but to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious, curious.